Well, winter's almost upon us. If you look behind me, you can actually see buds on this tree which will come out late winter, early spring. I'm interested today in looking at how we've come to this position in this country in 2026. And I'll be discussing the topic of how neoliberalism in the West has become the superhighway to neo-fascism. So before we look at this, we need to define terms like neoliberalism and neo-fascism. Neoliberalism, or the new liberalism, was based on the idea of ensuring that the state got out of the way of business and the corporate sector. It was about giving the state, allowing the state to be directed by the interests of a corporate sector which was interested in making profits irrespective of the human, social and environmental costs. The reform and revolutionary movements in the 19th century and the early part, the first half of the 20th century, forced the state to take on a new role. And that role was not just to protect those in authority, but also to ensure that citizens had access to the basic necessities. This meant that profitability for the private sector was driven down. So neoliberalism was about privatisation and demutualisation of mutual societies. It was about globalisation, which basically meant making the world your oyster, sending off production to areas of less costs, corporatisation, allowing the small business sector to be dominated by large corporations whose interests came before the small business sector, and deregulation, removing all those regulations which have been put in place to protect the individual and communities, not just from the arbitrary exercise of state power, but from the avarice of the corporate sector. Now, neo-fascism. What is neo-fascism, or the new fascism? Fascism has three components. One, an important component is race. Another important component is nationality. And the third component, which most people don't realise, is about corporate support. So I want to look at what's happened in this country in the last 50 years during the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation tsunami which was swept across every institution, every political party in this country. And why? This has opened the door, not just in Australia, but what most Western parliamentary democracy, to neo-fascism, authoritarianism, nationalism, racism, corporate domination. Well, what's happened in Australia has happened around the world in the parliamentary democracies. Globalisation meant that people's jobs disappeared. Corporatisation meant that most small businesses either made a minuscule profit or failed. Deregulation meant the laws that had been in place to protect the environment and individuals were swept aside. Privatisation meant that institutions which had been set up from the beginning of the century in this country, like the Commonwealth Bank, were basically given away for a bargain basement price to the corporate sector. For example, I think the price you could buy a Commonwealth Bank share when it was privatised were about $2.70. Today I think it's about $150. I'm not sure of the exact number. Commonwealth Serum Laboratory, $2.50. Today I think it's $200 to $300 per share. Now these changes had a profound impact on Australian society. It had a profound impact on the 90% of Australians who didn't have the disposable income to take advantage of investment-friendly legislation to maximise their wealth through investment. So what we saw during this period was the destruction of organisations like trade unions, which had been established to protect the interests of workers. And today, less than 12% of Australians belong to trade unions, and most of them are in the public sector. So what we saw is not a trickle-down effect as far as wealth is concerned, but what we saw and what we see when we look at every available statistical indicator is the fact that the gap between the rich and poor has increased exponentially. At the same time, through the introduction of university fees, through the opening of the residential property market to the investment as an investment vehicle, what we have seen as a consequence of neoliberal policies, we have seen a pauperisation of significant sections of the Australian community who are now spending most of their time working to pay their day-to-day expenses. So all the glories of privatisation, which were supposed to increase competition and decrease prices, were totally illusory. Prices have increased, competition has decreased. Nothing is more apparent than what has happened to housing. The destruction of the public housing sector has meant that competition in the housing sector has disappeared. And opening residential property to investors has meant that property prices have escalated by 4,000% since the mid-80s or the early 80s, while wages have increased by less than 700%. So no wonder we find ourselves in Australia and the Western parliamentary democracies in a situation where there is increasing levels of dissatisfaction and people are looking for answers to their problems. They are sick and tired of the old political parties, like the Liberal Party, which has been taken over by the Institute of Private Affairs. They like to call themselves public, but almost every branch of the Liberal Party is now dominated by people who support a neoliberal agenda. And we've seen the National Party, which has a history of over 100,000 years of protecting rural and regional communities, degenerating into an agribusiness party which supports the corporatisation of the rural sector. At the same time, we have seen the Australian Labor Party deny its origins. It's become a manager of capital for the corporate sector. So although occasionally it passes a few reforms, the fact is that the reforms that are needed in this country to ensure that everybody shares in the Commonwealth have not occurred. At the same time, we have seen an increase in immigration. So, in 2026, people are looking for answers to the situation they find themselves in. And what we're seeing is something very interesting, which we haven't seen since the 1920s in Germany and Italy and England, and to a lesser degree in Australia. What we are seeing is the rise of political organisations and political parties like Divided Nation, which are promoting a nationalist agenda which is based on race. And that's the important thing. Nationalism based on race. Because a neo-fascist ideology, a neo-fascist political movement needs an opposition which you can point out, which is visible. It needs to be able to manipulate the real dissatisfaction that an increasing number of Australians are feeling with the system and the mainstream political parties. It needs to manipulate that dissatisfaction and turn the gaze on the other in society. The migrant, the refugee, the person of a different sexual orientation, First Nations people, Muslims, anybody who is visibly different. We saw this in Germany, we saw this in Italy, to a lesser extent in Italy. So the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of nationalism, the rise of racism is the calling card of reform movements, or supposedly reform movements like Divided Nation or Reform in the United Kingdom, or the current so-called Republican administration in the US of A. So what we are seeing is a realignment, a major realignment of political forces. The dilemma is that nationalist, authoritarian, racist political movements and parties can usually be contained until the magic elixir is poured into them, and that is money from the corporate sector. The German Nazi Party rose and rose as corporate Germany put their money and backing behind the German state, behind their nationalist, racist agenda. We are now seeing in Australia billionaires pouring money into Divided Nation. We saw this in the United States of America, where billionaires poured money into the campaign of the Washington buffoon to be re-elected as president of the United States of America. The fact is, when the corporate world uses its resources to back a nationalist, racist agenda, we see an explosion in support for political movements and political parties like Divided Nation, which use divisive rhetoric to divide the nation and promote their political agenda. Currently, the main victims are the National Party, which will be wiped off the face of the earth after being here for 100 years because of its melding into the agri-corporate business sector, forgetting its regional roots, forgetting that its primary purpose was to look after the interests of people in rural and regional centres, and we're seeing divided nation rapidly consign them to the dustbin of history. At the same time, because of the Liberal Party's neoliberal policies, because its branches are moribund and there is no real discussion in its branches, because of its neoliberal philosophies, we've seen a fracturing of the Liberal Party, where the teal independents now represent the heartland of the old Liberal Party. So as divided nation gains momentum, the major losers will be the Liberal Party and the National Party. The National Party will be wiped out, the Liberal Party will become a rump of its former self. And it's quite likely, unless major changes are made in this country in the next 2 years, that divided nation will become the opposition, the main opposition party in federal parliament. Now they've had an easy run to date because people used words like racism, nationalism to describe them. But what we need to do is look at their policies. And their policies are based on the denial of the climate emergency. Their policies are based on division. Their policies are based on supporting the corporate sector to the hilt. It was quite interesting, the leader of Divided Nation claimed that the minor reforms that had been proposed by the Albanese-led Labor Party were communism. Now obviously, in 2026, fact and fiction meld into a new story. Facts are irrelevant. What's relevant is belief. And as more and more people believe that the traditional political parties are no longer relevant, we will see the growth of the divided nation. At the same time, what we are not seeing, because the so-called progressive movement has been tied up in identity politics, and the Green Party has shot itself in the foot by being almost totally involved in identity politics. We are not seeing a viable opposition grow in this country, whether parliamentary or extra-parliamentary, which is based on identifying the real issues that confront us, the issues which have created the very conditions which have seen the rise and rise of divided nation, the rise and rise of a neo-fascist ideology. And that is inequalities in power and wealth. While this country's wealth is controlled and manipulated by corporations, while we continue to be denied our birthright in this country, nothing will change. Even if, in the unlikely event that a divided nation becomes the government of the Commonwealth of Australia, the fact is their policies will not decrease inequality, will not create jobs, will not create housing for people, will not improve education outcomes. The fact is we are an ageing population and we need fresh blood in order to survive as a community and as a nation. That's why I encourage you to look around. Political movements, political parties, they put the public interest before corporate interests because that is the best solution to the current rise and rise of divided nation. So if you're interested, You can always join public interest before corporate interests. You can go to their webpage, public interest before corporate interests, and join online. You can also get involved in political and social and ideological campaigns around the country which promote the idea of increasing equality, increasing economic power by decreasing the power of corporations who currently determine parliamentary legislation. And whether divided nation ever achieves power or not, the fact is their policies will not in any way decrease inequality, improve access to housing, improve access to this country's wealth.